Hello.
We are here to record another one of our house series. We're going to talk about the third house today. And yeah, I think the third house, kind of gets ignored because it seems pretty boring once you're like, oh, communication, cool. But but I think if we dive in deeper and get to the underlying things of this
Mhm.
house, it'll hopefully change your mind and bring more attention to the third house.
Yeah, we definitely have some interesting things that we've noticed about the third house, or at least our third houses for sure. So that's
Yes. I think
that we
one in
can talk about.
particularly we alluded on in another episode. I don't remember which
Hmm.
one, but yeah. So maybe we'll talk about that in more extensively than we were planning
Yeah.
on because I do think that is really fascinating. So, just a few tidbits on the technical side of the third house in the natural zodiac, where we're saying there's an affinity between sign, house, and planet. So, starting natural zodiac starts at Aries. So, Aries, Taurus, so on and so forth. So, if we're looking at the third house, we're looking at the sign of Gemini. So, the third house can have an affiliation with the sign of Gemini and therefore the planet Mercury. I don't think they're an equal sign, but they definitely have a lot in common, some common ground. And then also, this house is where the moon finds its joy. So, joy is kind of an ancient way of looking at where the planets are most happy. And the moon is like super, super happy in the third house. So we'll try to find different comparisons or different ideas on why that might be, why the moon might be super happy there. So jumping into third house areas of life and what they encompass, the first thing I kind of wanted to look at was like the immediate environment or your surroundings. And so when we're thinking back to what we talked about in the second house with the baby in the crib, right? If you haven't watched the second house, go ahead and do so. I'm sure there'll be a link somewhere. Go back and check it out. So if we go back to the idea of the baby who puts everything in its mouth, right? It's if it's not food, then we're moving to the second step of the process. We're like, what is this then? So we put the rattle in our mouth. We're like, okay, I can't eat that. I'm going to shake it. We're going to think about we're going to think about like what is this thing used for? So that is where the third house kind of brings in this idea of Gemini and Mercury and thinking and like becoming like the I think house. Like we're in that process of what's around me and what is it best used for. So our immediate surroundings, like what are the things around me? What can they be used for? But obviously our number one most immediate surrounding is our parents, right? Like they're the one thing that we associate with, and in the second house where we're differentiating ourselves from our parents, and therefore they become an outside entity, like they become our immediate surroundings.
Hmm.
And for our parents are also like the first encounter we have with the outside world, the first encounter we have with the other. And so this is really interesting when thinking about third house and how it could play a role in our relational, like how we feel about our parents. But in general, parents are obviously super important to us as humans. We're not going to be here without our parent biologically.
Hmm.
But because they're so important, they can be shown all over the chart. They can play in different houses. They could fall more in the fourth or the 10th, or the house that your IC falls in, because with the house system we're using, your IC is a floater. It can fall in different houses. And then it can also, parents can show up in planets. Like for me specifically, my dad shows up as my Saturn. And so it's just, as far as talking about third house, I kind of want to glaze over the parent part a little bit, but just know that because your parents are your first immediate contact with the other, your first immediate surrounding, encompassing place, that it can fall into the house. But we can kind of talk about parents in our fourth house episode. if that's cool for you. I know
Yeah.
my IC does fall in the third, so I think sometimes I personally get those things mixed up because they're natally like a conjoined third, fourth house together type deal.
Hmm.
So that's kind of confusing. But as far as we're thinking about early childhood and our immediate surroundings, parents are obviously in the picture.
Hmm.
And then the other person, people, maybe not people, are siblings that show up in the third house because they're also that early childhood development of the people around us. So the third house can kind of speak to the relationships we have with siblings or the people we include in our peer groups. You can speak to this as being like an only child if you've seen any third house equivalents to like childhood friends or something like that.
Well, I feel like that kind of like for me overlaps with that and maybe the next thing that we have to talk about because
Okay.
so like my third house is empty. Like I don't have any planets in my third house or anything like that. So I have an Aquarius third house. But and I'm an only child, so I don't really have anything like going on in there. But I collect people who are Aquarius placements without realizing it. So my mom is an Aquarius rising, and then my childhood best friend is an Aquarius moon, and you're an Aquarius moon and
Sun.
sun. Sorry. I'm like,
It's
obviously.
all good.
And then, my partners have Aquarius moons. Yeah. And you have an Aquarius sun. And so I have all of these like little like Aquarius placements slash like a lot of left-handed people too. I like feel like I don't know if
Right?
that's
We're just
related somehow,
quirky like
but we're
Aquarius.
like, but I have all these like little like Aquarius placements that I'm always collecting, right? And so, and especially if we're talking about this is where like the moon likes to be, right? So maybe people, especially with Aquarius moons, likes to be in there. But I just always, once I realized that because I had done a lot of different charts and started to like see this pattern, and I was like, that's really interesting because I don't have siblings, but I do tend to make people like I don't have a lot of friends. I've never been like there have been like maybe two times in my life where I've had like a group of friends. Like I've had a couple of like periods where it's, like in grad school, like I kind of had a group of people I hung out with, or in high school, I had the speech and debate team. But usually what I have is I have one really close friend, and that's like and I spend all my time with them. Like my childhood best friend was like my sister, basically. We're always over at each other's houses and having sleepovers, and we knew everything about each other and all that. So I feel like that house for me is, I'm missing this like sign. I don't have any air placements really. So it's I'm like somebody else come and provide me with that air sign energy because like I don't got any. So
Yeah, for sure. So the sign on the house can speak to the person. Like you said, it's not always like I'm the sun, but there's different other
Mhm.
planets like risings and moons and so forth. But it's a predominant like Aquarius theme as a sign. And for me, my third house is Libra, and my sister I grew up with is a Libra sun. So there can be the literal tangible this is a Libra person in place of that house, or it could just speak to the relationship or the bond between people. It's more the tone, the sign sets the tone for the relationship or how we see the person. Because not always will the people in our immediate say, okay, so if we jump down to our next topic of neighborhoods and neighbors, because when you're a child, you're like playing out in the neighborhood, you're meeting neighborhood friends, you're like, it is your world. Like I grew up in a cul-de-sac, and like that cul-de-sac
Mhm.
was literally my world before I went to school, right? So if we think about meeting neighbors, obviously you're not going to be completely surrounded with Aquarius neighbors, right? I mean, who knows? You maybe if you pull the
Just start
charts,
going
that'd be
around the
super
neighborhood. You're
interesting.
like, hey, if you're interested, please send me your birth information.
Yeah. I mean, that would be a very interesting experiment, and I'm sure there's some sort of super Scorpio placement like investigator when it comes to astrology, but for the most part, we're going to say that not every single person we meet in our neighborhood is going to have the placement of our sign, right? But how do we feel about our neighborhood? For the most part, as a Libra third house, I felt pretty peaceful and coherent with my neighborhood until I wasn't, which is a really interesting thing because
Mm.
Libra often talks about like polarities and like the other. And so I felt really like a cohesive unit until there was one or two different things that all of a sudden, oh, that's the difference between you and me. So it's not necessarily that all my neighborhood kids were Libras, but the way I approached the relationship to them or how I felt about
Mm.
my neighborhood in general, right?
Mm.
So, this idea of collecting people is really interesting because you would expect it to be a more like cohesive, like I feel in a Libran fashion for my neighborhood, for my family, for my immediate environment. But instead, we're seeing super tangible. No, these are Aquarius people. I know their chart. I've done the research. And my sister is a Libra. And my partner right now is a Libra. And his sister, one of his sisters, is a Libra. There's a lot of Libra people, sons specifically, in my immediate environment right now. But I kind of implore people to really look into that because it's really eye opening. And then when you think about, okay, if I'm collecting the people literally of my third house,
Mm.
I'm collecting the Aquarius, I'm collecting the Libras, what is that supposed to teach me? What is that supposed to make me think? Third house is a lot
Mhm.
about questioning because we're bringing in that Gemini energy, right? So, like, why? Why am I collecting Aquarius people? What do they have to show me? You were pointing out,
Mhm.
like, oh, I don't have any air in my chart. I'm going to need
Mhm.
to project or to not overcompensate, but, fill in that void. And the only way we
Mhm.
can really do that if we're not, like, say, using the internal way of Aquariusing to project that and find the people that will show
Mhm.
us how to do the Aquarius thing, right?
That's interesting too, because I feel it gives me one of the things that I like, right, is to have conversations. And so I feel like air signs are very conversational, maybe in different ways, but I'm not one to usually initiate conversations, I guess. I'm just one to, if I get interested, I'll get pulled into it, or I like to have a conversation about a thing or something. So maybe I need that inspiration or that poking from somebody else to do those kinds of things. But I was also thinking about it and I was like, you know what? Because, you were saying your partner is also in your third house, right? I realized my mom, her first husband, my dad, he would be in her seventh house, but her second husband, who she's been married to a lot longer, he's in her third house, along with all
Mm.
of her siblings, or a lot of her siblings that she's really close to, are also Aries placements in her third house. And then I am in one of my partner's third house because I have a Sagittarius third house. So it kind of is
Mm.
interesting if we're thinking about, I feel a lot of the time when we're thinking about love, right? We're not really looking at the third house. We're usually looking at like the seventh
Mm-hmm.
house or the fifth house, right? I wonder if there's something about if you want really like that kind of love where people talk about, oh, you want to be like best friends with your partner,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe that's coming from more of a third house place. If you have somebody in your life with really,
Mm.
who like has a lot of placements in your third house or important placements in your third house, maybe that's actually like a really good kind of like synastry kind of thing to look for too when it comes to love, because that gives you that sort of like foundation of friendship that's, oh, we're like so close, maybe not like siblings, hopefully, like close
Right.
in the way that siblings might be close, right? Like where it's like you share those things together and have that kind of bond that they might have. So,
Right. And oh my gosh, so many things. so so going back on the relationship between third and seventh, in technical astrology, they're trines. So what that means is they're favorable to each other, they're complementary because they're the same element.
hmm
So if you are automatically looking for a if you're going by the seventh house and mine is Aquarius and I'm looking for an airy person, I might stumble upon a Gemini because they're the other people that are going to stimulate that intellectual,
Hmm.
conversation that you're talking about, and be able to fill that air void just in a slightly different way. Maybe I need to be questioned versus think outside the box. Or maybe that person does have both placements and they fill both voids. But
Hmm.
that idea of marrying your best friend or surrounding yourself with a person, especially if we go back to the idea of having an IC in the third like I do,
Hmm.
and that kind of connecting to home and family. Because obviously, if you're, well, not obviously, most of the time when you're with somebody, you'll cohabitate, you'll be in
Hmm.
the same house, and therefore you and them will both create your immediate surroundings, right? Yeah, it's just a really interesting take on this idea of marrying your best friend and like how close you can be to somebody, and the idea that the third and seventh are trine, so they're working
Hmm.
harmoniously together in the same sort of element. So I was just starting to read the Book of Air because I'm obsessed with Stephen Forrest. We've talked about him before, and I'm literally like in the first or second chapter, but Air, he kind of boiled down so far into the one thing that connects us. It's the one thing that we all have in common. We all need oxygen, like literally, right?
Hmm.
And so not only are we thinking about the third house in an airy fashion of I'm connecting because we're talking, we're having a conversation, we're like mutually, hopefully mutually receptive. And air is the one thing that we might have in common with the people around us in our neighborhood. Maybe we're from a different country or something, and we move into this neighborhood and we don't have any commonalities, any interests or anything. But in the US, there's a commonality of let's go outside and play nice and talk about the weather. We can talk. Talking is communication of any time, even if you're not, if you came from another country and you speak another language. There's ways of communicating, right? And that's the one bridge that connects you to your immediate surroundings, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. So, since you've pointed it out, we've both come to notice this pattern of collecting people in our immediate environment, whether partners, family, friends, of the sign on our third house. And so, going back and thinking about our immediate environment, we're literally surrounding ourselves with the people of our third house.
Hmm.
So it can show us the actual people, like we said, or it can show us how we show up for those people or how they show up for us. So when we're talking about air signs for both of us, we're talking about the people that are stimulating our intellectual side. We're conversation making people. So in my case, not only have I collected Libra people around me, Libra suns specifically, I tend to communicate and interact with people in like a Libran fashion. Like, I used to be a super big people pleaser, and that's something Libra placements can deal with sometimes. So I'm a recovering people pleaser. Hi, my name's Kalia. But I try to treat people with kindness and with empathy and with fairness, right? Um, so that people feel welcome around me. So I feel like not only will you collect the people, but you'll kind of build those relationships based on the signs and planets in your third house. But definitely, if you can, make the connection of what people are your true third house people, because I think that is really telling.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it would be interesting to see. You should do a survey sometime or something, It's your third house. Do you have any important relationships in your third house, or like how many, or do you notice a pattern? Because I would be interested to see how many people have those kinds of connections in their life. So,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I haven't really heard anyone talk about it quite the way of collecting people. And I think that's a
hmm.
really cool thing to think about. When it comes to our immediate surroundings, we're also talking about our perception of what's around us because, like we kind of touched in the first house episode, we have this filter of how we see the world, which I'll kind of talk about how it changes in the third house, I think, a little bit later. But we all have this like idea. So my idea of seeing the world is Libran through Libra lenses, right? Um, and how that filters our surroundings, because no matter how you come into the world, I came into the world as a Leo, so I'm going to naturally be Leo tendencies and act out my life in a Leo fashion. But depending on where you're placed, like this idea of, you know, coming from another country and being placed down, your immediate environment could be like a super culture shock, right? Like you could be surrounded by different cultural practices that you're not used to, or languages, or all these things. And with that switch in environment, how do you perceive things now? That's kind of where the third house is talking about. What is your views versus what is actually going on? What's going on in my neighborhood now? Kids play jump rope outside, right? But in my old country, jump ropes were only for exercise. I don't know where this example is coming from, but you know, like jump ropes weren't recreational. They weren't for play. They're like for discipline, military exercise, right? And now these kids are like having fun with jump rope. What does that mean about my way of thinking? How can I now question, well, why can't jump ropes be fun? I don't know. That's a really weird example. Like your environments change the way you think, right? Or can,
Hmm.
if you let it.
Definitely, I feel like I've moved a lot in my life. I did that like little map one time, and I've lived in four different states at this point. Technically, I lived in another country for 10 weeks. In each state have moved multiple times. So, like, my environment has been changing even since I was a kid, right? And maybe it's because I have so many planets in Sagittarius, or because I have, that stuff in my fourth house. But I've always been moving. And I've found that in each environment that I've been in, I feel kind of almost like a different person, and my life is very different. It's not just, oh, I moved to this place. And so now it's, oh, I have maybe. I go to a different coffee shop or something. It's no, like I switch from, in Boise, I was like constantly working out of coffee shops, like on my laptop, and I was like going to hockey games all the time, and I was out and I was like really active and stuff like that. When I was in Bellingham, I was more about my higher education, like the whole time I was like basically in school while I was living there, except for the first few years. And so everything was about that, or about doing things for myself, like those artist dates that I used to go on and learning stuff. That's where I like got back into tarot, or when we were doing collage, I was like doing a lot of activities and stuff like that. And then Klamath Falls, it was like nothing. Like it was like, I was home or I was at work, and I was like home or I was at work. And I have like different, like very drastically different routines. Like in every city I've lived in, it's not just, oh, I'm doing like a different coffee shop. I'm not even going to coffee shops. It's like a whole different way of life, or a different way of existing in the neighborhood that I'm in. So
Mm.
that's it definitely changes my perspective, because I always feel like a whole different person depending on where I'm at.
Yeah, you have one way of living, and then you move somewhere where the predominant culture is doing this other thing. Bellingham is a very college town, so you moved there
Mhm.
and went to college, but it's also, even if you're not in college, it's very
Yeah.
focused around education. And so you start thinking then, oh, maybe I do want to be a part of this. Like, what things do I want to adapt from the environment I'm in? And then you start changing your perspective and changing your opinions on your life before versus your life now because of your immediate environment.
Hmm.
Super interesting for sure. And as you were talking, it also made me think about, which I don't know if we really need to go into, but it's interesting to think about astrocartography. Changing your immediate environment can activate different places in your chart, because don't want to go too deep into astrocartography, but you have lines that represent each planet and angle in your chart, right? And so like you're currently now in your sun, basically sun line. And
Hmm.
so like you're going to be acting different than you were on, say, was Saturn your
I think it was Saturn and
Bellingham line?
Bellingham. I think Bellingham was Saturn, which makes sense because
Yeah.
that was where I was putting in the years of work to
Mm,
get my job and stuff. But also that's, Aquarius and Capricorn. So it's like second and third house, basically, like right there. So
mm.
that's like,
Yeah. So I don't know. That was just interesting thought I was thinking about while we were
hmm
talking about it. Speaking of thinking, the next thing on our list for topics of the third house is just mental activity, just like mental stimulation, like we're talking about this relationship of air signs, um, and the idea of this house being boiled down to the I think house. So going back to like early childhood development, because not only does the third house kind of deal with early childhood development, we were starting this journey with the houses kind of talking about babies. So
hmm
so once the child is out of the crib, there's like a series of mental activity that happens, a series of learning that naturally happens. Like you have to learn how to crawl, you have to learn how to speak, you have to learn how to walk and play, and there's like constant stimulation of mental energy and mental focus on learning the next thing that you have to evolve in life, right? And it's also a time where, like I said, we're starting to learn language, so we're starting to verbalize things and we're starting to actually name things. So when I think about the difference of verbalizing, what's an example? If you had your favorite teddy bear as a kid or whatever, and up until then, it's just been teddy bear, and then that's like verbalizing something. I want my bear. But to me, naming things is a step of that perception that, like, how do I feel? It's a thinking step. How do I feel about this
hmm
teddy bear? It's not just teddy bear, it's now Mervin. Mervin has a
hmm
personality. Mervin satiates my emotional side in a certain way. Like, kids have
specific and
security
unique.
blankets. Yeah, exactly. So this process of naming things, I think, goes a little bit further. And even like with family members, not everyone calls their grandma grandma. Like it could be
hmm
Nana, it could be whatever. And that's like a different level of language. It's like more of a personal, what does this thing mean to me? What does this person bring to me? I think it takes more mental energy than just learning this is grandma, this is teddy bear, this
hmm
is my blanket. It's, what are these things to me? What are their uses to me? And therefore, it's kind of different than the idea of just learning English or whatever.
hmm
Um, so we start to like separate ourselves out in the second house, and then we start like naming things and relating to things in the third house. And then after we've learned all this early childhood stuff, we go to school, and school's like a whole new bag of worms, right?
hmm
We might be going to daycare, we might be going to preschool, elementary school. All these things have to do with the third house because these are all our first interactions outside of the home. So our first interactions with ourselves are usually our parents, siblings, and then our first interactions outside of the home bring in, well, neighborhood friends too, but we have meet more people at school, we have
hmm
teachers, we have all the things. So any early childhood education places are involved in the third house. And I want to make a distinct difference between third and ninth house because some people are like, oh, education belongs in the ninth house. And I think that the early childhood stuff is in the third, whereas higher education is in the ninth. So there's not everyone goes to college, not everyone like pursues anything past where their country says you're good to go, you're an adult now. And the ninth house is more right brained. And the third house is more left brain, where it's more linear logic, fact checking, thinking. Like these are the
hmm
concrete steps to learn. Like this is the ABCs to language, where ninth house takes the language a step further into creative writing.
I think of Gemini and Sagittarius, right? Or like this third and ninth house kind of divide as Gemini knows a lot of like facts, right? They're going to know a little bit about a lot of different topics, which is kind of what you
Like
get when you're
trivia.
doing, yeah, like when you're doing the breadth part of your education, which is really anything up until you get to the last couple of years of a bachelor's degree, right? So even like the first couple of years, or if you go to community college, like I did, it's all that stuff is like the breadth of education where you're supposed to learn a little bit about a wide variety of topics so that you're like rounded in your knowledge. And I feel like that's Gemini or that's like kind of third house stuff. Whereas, like, I feel ninth house stuff or Sagittarius stuff is I'm going to the depth of this topic to learn as much about this one specific thing as possible. And so it's like doing the deep dive and being like philosophical about it and asking like the big questions about it or like looking at the big picture about it. Whereas
Yeah.
Gemini, I feel like with that Mercury stuff, is more about like, little details or something. Here's one specific fact about this thing or something. So,
Yeah.
like, podcast kind of stuff or trivia kind of stuff, just breadth of knowledge kind of stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely. Good explanation. So, places that the third house include are just classrooms, schooling, studies, places where there's instruction. Okay, let's talk about vocational school. So, vocational school to me, I feel is part third and part ninth, right? You're learning the basics. Say you go to cosmetology school or fashion
Hmm.
school or something like that. The third house will be all those little techniques you use to become successful in your career. So, like color theory or like how to sharpen your hair shears or something like that, right? But then we do kind of take that and go deeper into the subject and be like, how would we approach finding the right haircut for this person? Or I don't know, what's a good example of ninth house in that instance? I don't know. My point is that we think of vocational school as higher education, right?
Hmm.
But it could also encompass a lot of the third house elementary education where
Maybe
we're
it's just like
learning
depending on
things.
like how far you go into that. If you're like apprenticing at a trade or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you get to that like master level of it, right? You're like a master electrician or something. That's
Mm-hmm.
still, I think that would be like nice because you know everything there is to know about it to the point that you can go beyond just like what the textbook would tell you to what are like the facts about this thing to that kind of almost like intuitive understanding that some people have about their job, right? You've done it
Yeah.
so long and you know it so well that you just know certain things once you get to that point. That was one of the things that I found hardest when I first started teaching, right? Is that I teach writing. I've always been good at writing. That was just the thing that I was like naturally good at school. So having to figure out how to teach it to other people was actually not easy because it was like, well, I just know how to, like, I know this
Right.
sentence sounds wrong, but I can't tell you why. And so I had to actually kind of go back a few steps and be like, if I didn't know, how would I explain this or how would I need to think about this? And I've gotten a lot better at it now, hopefully. So, but it's like one of those things, right, where it's I think that the steps it takes you to get to that point are kind of maybe third house because that's
Mm-hmm.
like the taking in the knowledge, like learning the facts. Like here's a noun is, a person, place, or thing, right? That's like a fact about,
Right.
language, but just knowing like not having to think that's a noun, but just like knowing, oh, this is like in the incorrect place in this sentence, or this doesn't work in this sentence. I feel like that's going beyond because it's you now know this thing well enough that you don't have to think about it anymore, that it's no longer in the I think part. Now you've moved beyond this to be able to
Yeah.
either critique other people's work or to be able to train somebody else or something like that, because now you really understand this topic at the best level it could be understood, whatever that topic is. And I think that can be true of even stuff that's not necessarily specifically like job related or education related. But if you were to like play a game for however many hours that you like fully intuitively understood everything that you were supposed to do in it, or, whatever your hobby is, if you knit, right? And you knit to the point that you can make these beautiful designs and patterns and stuff like that. If you're no longer doing like the basics or like having to think in your head, it's now beyond that step where you can fully just
Right.
express your creativity.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the difference between knowledge and wisdom is just that Oh my gosh.
Implementation
Thank you.
or
Yeah. Implementate. Implementation. Applying your
applying.
knowledge. English is not my thing. Sure, I speak English. I speak American. But yeah, the step of tangible. Holy shit. The step of tangible.
Oh no.
Applying your knowledge tangibly. What is
In a
happening?
tangible way.
Okay,
In
let's
a,
move on. No, but the other thing, other than that piece of knowledge versus wisdom that didn't happen, was you brought up apprenticeship, and I think that's really
Mhm.
interesting because we're looking at this affiliation with Mercury and Gemini, but Mercury also rules Virgo, and Virgo to
Mhm.
me is this epitome of apprenticeship. You're taking in
Mhm.
all the pieces and
Mhm.
you're subservient under your master, right? And so third house I feel can be very apprenticey to build up your skills, to be
Mhm.
able to apply them tangibly, implement them tangibly in
Mhm.
the ninth house, without that having to break it down like you were talking about with your
Mhm.
teaching. So, yeah, places of instruction, teaching, writing, speaking, communication. When we start learning, we start diving into books and reading and stuff. So, books can also talk about the third house, but basically, any place, thing, object that information is exchanged in, information is conveyed in, or information is given at hand is third house topics. So, media, the exchange of information through media, whether that's print or digital, newspapers, TV, videos, audiobooks, whatever. But one thing I really like is the idea of radio, because radio conveys this like dichotomy of the talking and listening part. Because I think the receiving of the information is often overlooked when we're thinking about the third house. We're like, oh, it's all about communication, like talk, 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 talk. When you think about Gemini, pop
Mhm.
culture is like talk, talk. But it's not like the act of speaking, the act of audibly saying things out loud. It's the exchange of information. We have a purpose. We have to get our point across. And so the listening part, I think, is really crucial in the third house, because communication is a two-way street. We can't have
Mhm.
this conversation without somebody taking it in, right? I
Yeah.
mean, we can talk to ourselves, which is fine. And sometimes we talk back, or sometimes we get the aha moments by speaking it out loud. But it's that exchange of the aha ness that makes it communication. And therefore, we need two parties for that, right? We're talking about the Gemini twins aspect also.
Mhm.
So, yeah, talking and listening, connecting with friends, connecting with people, peers. Oh, yeah, I think that's where I was going to say I was going to talk about it later. So, school is obviously a place where exchanging of information, but if we go back to ourselves in this early childhood development of the school or the playground, the, daycare, wherever it is where we're meeting our peers, is the first time where we are able to test out our viewpoints, or like we're able to expand our perception on things. Because coming from, say, I had a really strict background, a really strict upbringing, and I wasn't allowed to watch certain shows or whatever. So if I think that's normal, oh, my parents don't want me to watch this show because they're protecting me, and that's my filter on things, like, oh, I get it,
Mhm.
that's fair, because Libra.
Mhm.
They don't want me to see this, I'm not ready for it. But if I go to school and I say, hey, you're allowed to watch that show, what do you mean, that's isn't that bad for you? And my friends, no, it's fine, it's really funny, you should watch it anyway, blah blah blah, right? That's like an exchange of information that's important for
Mhm.
changing my perception on my home environment and what is good for me then, right? If
Mhm.
my whole world just got blown up because maybe my parents are like not protecting me, but sheltering me. There's a
Right.
level of thinking and perceiving you have when you start encountering other people's and other viewpoints and other experiences of life. So, like, when you're talking to other people and you are able to compare their experiences with your own, and therefore all of a sudden that filter you came into the world with, like we were talking about in the first house, that filter now is being compromised or it's being questioned at some
Mm.
level. And so it has to change. So this is like our first encounter with trying to think through if the things that we're thinking and the ways we're viewing our immediate surroundings or our life in general, if they're still correct. Like, I come in
Mm.
Leo, I'm super optimistic that my parents are protecting me from whatever harm I may be encountering with this show. I'm now being faced with friends that are like, nah, it's funny, you should watch it. I have to question that and be like, is it really fair? When my
Hmm.
Libra comes out, is this really fair? Should I speak up about it? Should I be like, no, it's not fair. My friends get to watch this. They're fine.
I wonder too how much that's affected by the modality of the sign, right? If it's like fixed or
Mm,
cardinal or what, like how, you're taking in this information or how you are
totally.
like conveying information to other people, right? That it's
Yeah,
like
totally. So, our next idea in the third house is this idea of short distance travel. So, going back to our baby, once you leave the crib, you're learning how to move, right? You're literally like crawling, walking, all the things. But this can also deal with like your neighborhoods, your local travel. So, commuting or running around town and running errands and stuff is something that I've thought of. And I've thought of also because I was writing my notes out on my porch and looking at my yard, and there was this beautiful butterfly, and I'm like, yeah, butterflies and bees, like any pollinators that go from
Hmm.
flower to flower, really make me think of that Gemini, that like short distance travel, and like the curiosity, right? Like, I
Mm.
don't know. So I wanted to bring that into the mix with this idea of short distance travel. So, thinking about the butterfly or the bee that like travels flower to flower, and each pollinator just has this short spurt visits of visiting different flora, fauna, trees, bushes, whatever. And then our running around flower to flower would be like our running errands. So I have to go to this appointment, and then afterwards I have to go to the grocery store, and I have to get gas, and then I have to go to the pet store. And this is all like a really visual representation of what short distance travel can encompass. But with my Libra devil advocate side, I want to be like, who sets the limits? What is short distance versus long distance travel, and like weighing the options of what, kind of like we did with third and ninth, like where's the limit of what makes it knowledge versus wisdom, what makes it third house versus ninth house, because ninth
Mhm.
house can also deal with travel. So what constitutes a short distance here? So ninth house can deal with long distance, but more specifically foreign, right?
Mhm.
So I think arguably that the third house can encompass a person's country, like not just running around town. Like, we're all in this country. Obviously, culturally, we set our boundaries and borders or whatever it is, but I think that can be included because it's up into the ninth house. So, for example, there's
Mhm.
some people who live in the middle of the country and it'll take days to get to another country. Or there's me and you, where you see Mexico from your window and I see Canada from my window, and it'll
Mhm.
take, a couple miles to get to another country. So it's short
Mhm.
distance, but it's going to foreign, right? So who's to say my short distance travel to Canada isn't a ninth house trip? I guess is what I'm getting at.
Mhm.
So if we think again to this idea of bees going from flower to flower, we can clearly see the short distances from each flower. But I currently work with a beekeeper. If anyone needs any raw local honey, go to mariesbees.com. They're amazing. But bees can actually travel 5 miles from their hive. So once you see a bee working in your garden from flower to flower, they could have traveled miles to get there, right? So
Mm-hmm.
is this a short distance trip or a long distance trip? And technically it's their commute because they're working ladies and they have to get their pollen like on a daily basis, going out up to 5 miles. So I went on this really mercurial journey while writing these notes, and I wanted to do the math of if a bee is like an inch and they can travel up to 5 miles in a day, what is the equivalent of a human traveling, that much at our size? So if anyone out there is like super good at math and their math is mathing, there's an option to do a voice message for the podcast now. Send us a voice message, and if we like your calculations, I'll put it in a future episode update. But is that long distance? Because if you look at a bee traveling 5 miles, that's incredible, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they do it daily, food pending, of course.
Mm-hmm.
They don't always go 5 miles, but it's a commute for them. They're working. That would be like us. I'm just going to throw out a number because, like I said, I do not do math. And apparently, this episode, I do not do English. So I don't know what exactly I do. But that'd be like us, like, walking 400 miles to eat a day. I know people who won't walk the same distance as a bee. I know people who won't walk 5 miles for their meal, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
where's the cutoff? What is short distance? What is long distance?
Maybe it's like relative to the person because maybe we get used to different distances too. Because I've had times in my life where my commute to work was like 45 minutes each way.
Yeah.
And then I have had times where, like, now where I work from home, basically. So, what I would consider to be a long drive now is kind of different. And also,
Mm-hmm.
too, depending on where I've lived from other people, right? Because I've got on a lot of 14-hour road trips, right? Because I've lived in different states from my parents a lot of the time. And so I would do that, or, I have to take flights now because it would be a lot longer. So, what is short, like, to me, like a 14-hour road trip was actually not that bad. Like, by the
Right.
time that, because, and then, so then when I was, living in Oregon, it was only 7 hours. And I was like, this is short, so easy. I can do this whole thing. I don't even have to leave first thing in the morning and I can still get there by the end of the evening and stop and it's fine. So, whereas I know that I've heard people in, Europe or whatever, oh my God, it's 45 minutes away. That's so
Right.
far, right? And I'm like, 45 minutes, like that's, so I feel like maybe it's like what is short or long is probably relative to what you like your current like situation, because it's like,
Exactly.
if you're not doing big commutes, then a 45-minute commute might feel like a really long distance kind of travel. Like that's too far. I would never commute that long or something. But
Exactly. Yeah. Precisely. So I definitely am sticking to the stance of what is the reason behind it. If I'm going to Canada and it's 4 miles away from me, it's not a short distance trip because it's international and therefore it's a
Mhm.
foreign trip and it's ninth house. Or the commuting, yeah, if I think it's reasonable, if my immediate environment, I'm going to kind of stretch out here, but if I move to a place because the immediate environment or the neighborhood is what I want, and I find work, but work is further out, like 45 minutes to an hour, it's justifiable. And the reason for that longer commute is to go to work, and therefore it's more of a short distance commute, then I think it's still third house, even though it's a long trip.
Mhm.
And like another example, when my family moved when I was 6, my mom was in love with her hair lady. And after we moved, she would commute back to our old town. I'm talking over an hour and a half, about 80 miles from where we live to go get her hair done. Is that a short distance trip? No, 80 miles for your hair is kind of ridiculous. But it comes back to this one, it comes back to the reason we're doing an errand kind of thing. So it really is
Mhm.
kind of like a short travel trip. Two, we haven't really talked about the moon in represent joy in this house, but the moon is all about familiarity and intimacy and closeness. You have the familiarity of this hairstylist that you've known for, I don't know, by that time, probably decades.
Mm-hmm.
And she knew what she was going to get. She had the safety of knowing Tammy could do
Mm-hmm.
her hair the way she's done it for decades, and it was like secure and safe in going there. Not only the
Mm-hmm.
safety of the beautician, going back to our old hometown, it's the safety of that place. That's a familiar place to be in.
Mm-hmm.
She knows when she gets there what roads to take, all going back to that third house idea versus ninth house.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely relative, like you said. What's
Mm-hmm.
okay? What do we justify? What are our reasons behind it? And that the actual physical distance isn't necessarily what makes it third or ninth house. Also, I think preparation has a lot to do with the third house versus ninth house. So I think third house trips are things that you don't have to plan for. You can easily just jump right in the car and go do whatever you need to do, and it's easy to come home. Like for
Mm-hmm.
me, international to Canada is really easy. It's 4 miles away. I already have my passport. I already know what it's like going through the border. It's just get in my car, do the thing, go have lunch, come back. That to me is really easy.
Mm-hmm.
So, in that aspect, it's third house. But in the aspect that we're literally crossing our border, then it's ninth house. So, there's definitely a push pull play on this, and I just want people to kind of change their paradigm over, well, it's more than 5 miles, so it's got to be ninth house because it's long
Mm-hmm.
distance. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Well, yeah, because when I was working, I would say, when I was working for that little cruise line that would go between Bellingham and Canada and the San Juans and stuff, and that was like for work. Not me being on the cruise because like I just liked the tickets and stuff, but we got the free rides, right? And I feel like that was kind of more, it could have been a mix of both the third and the ninth, because especially at that time for me, that was like new going to Canada. And so that was kind of like a foreign thing or whatever. But what I found when I got there was, oh wow, it feels really a lot like Bellingham in terms of the environment, at least
Yeah.
felt very similar. So it didn't feel like super foreign as opposed to like when I went to Italy and it was like, oh, this feels very foreign to me. This does not feel like home in any way. So how does it feel? Does it feel foreign is also part of it, right? Because if it feels like home, if it feels very, I know where things are, I know the language, I know how to get around, or it's like easy to do those things as opposed to having like really different rules or things like
Mm-hmm.
that, where it's, oh, I'm not used to this, or I don't know what I'm doing here, then that feels like a bit more foreign and maybe is a bit more ninth house.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I don't know if I have a complete thought here, but the idea of that learning element of the third house and your bubble can expand. So I've been
Mm-hmm.
to Canada more. I know kilometers now. So my bubble and what feels comfortable for me can expand to include that thing. So yeah, very interesting. And then when we circle back to the moon's joy here, and if we think about moon in the context of short distance travel, the moon is the closest to the earth, right? And therefore it has the shortest journey around us and around the sun. It moves through signs like 2.5 days, 2-ish days. It's the quickest moving astrological planet. Obviously, it's a luminary. So, once again, that's a distance that is relative. Clearly, we're not
Mm-hmm.
going to say that the distance the moon takes to orbit around us or orbit around the sun is a short distance, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not. But in comparison to the other planets, it for sure is. So, I just think this idea of distance, short and long, is kind of a watered down version of what we want to encompass in the third house specifically. Okay, so moving on to the moon. We talked about the moon in distance, we talked about the moon in like familiarity and comfort, security levels. The moon also can talk about like intuition and divination type practices. And I thought this was interesting to bring into the third house and kind of compare it out with different houses, because it's another one of those things that like kind of like sex. You see sex and like, oh, it's fifth house, or is it eighth house, or is it
Mm-hmm.
both? What's the reason behind the sex is what makes it you know,
Right.
differentiated between the houses. So if we talk about divination, that can be included in many different houses, but how is it included in the third house? So for example, both you and I are card slingers. We like to dabble in the tarot and stuff like that. So let's use that as our divination practice. And that can be seen in a ninth house way where we're like gaining wisdom from outer sources, right? Or it can be seen in a sixth house way where it's like, no, we're practicing. Like, this is a daily habit. We do tarot every day,
Hmm.
9 a.m. I don't know, whatever. It's a habitual task. And then it can be seen in the third house where we're probably going to talk more about what does the empress mean? Like, what is the skills needed to be able to read a deck of cards? What is the symbolism of the number 3? What is like
Hmm.
yellow mean? It's breaking down the divination practice into bite-sized pieces, I think. What do you
Hmm.
think?
Yeah, I mean, it could be like, either communicating that information to other people, or like you said, the skills or the steps it takes to learn it or to understand it. Whereas maybe in the opposite, right? If we were looking at it in the ninth house, it would be if you go from, okay, here's all the little different symbols on the Fool, right, in the third house, and this is like what each one of them means and stuff. The ninth house would be like, what does this all add up to? What is like the philosophy of this card? What is like the feeling behind it or the big picture? Or how
Yeah.
does it relate to the other cards as like the whole in this reading? I think almost anything you can kind of look at in all the houses, right? If you're, oh, well, my love life or something, it's not just like two houses. You could look at every single house and how that's going to affect that aspect of your life. So I
Mm-hmm.
think it's just they're all going to have a different kind of way that they impact it. So,
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, because we're dealing with a wheel. I also think about the third house kind of with this like writing element and learning element, like the practice of once you pull the tarot cards, you have a tarot journal and you write down and you document your
mhm.
readings every time you do it or whatever. Okay, let's move on to third house perfection years. So, perfections is an ancient Hellenistic timing technique that both Michelle and I use to look at different themes that are going to come up for you at the time of starting your birthday to your next birthday. Basically, perfections is just a fancy word to say progress or to advance through your chart. So each year you're looking at a different house that's being activated for you depending on your age. And we now, dun dun dun, dun have a cute little PDF called House Magic available in the link below that'll have a little cheat sheet where you can just find your age on the wheel and then see what house that correlates to. And it also has a lot of other handy reference guides in that PDF as well. But for third house perfection years, we're looking at age 2, 14, 26, 38, 50, 62, 74, 86, and 98. Do you have any third house perfection years that are
Ooh,
interesting?
actually. So, okay, so the first one, obviously, I was too young to really know. I was like, two, but
Yeah.
with teen, and I think that this is one that could be applied to pretty much most people, is you're moving from the eighth to ninth grade. So generally you're moving schools, right? So I went from being in middle school to being in high school. So that's like a short move, like a short distance move for me in terms of like where I was going to school. And then it's also an education related thing, right? You're moving from
Mm.
one level of education to the next. For me, though, that was particularly interesting in terms of being a third house year because that's when I joined the speech and debate team. So, talking about
Oh.
communication and also short distance travel, because a lot of the travel I did as a teenager was through the speech and debate team. Like, we went to California to go to Berkeley, or we went to Washington. The first time I ever went to Washington was actually like the through the speech and debate team. We went to Auburn. And so we went to these different like tournaments and there was a lot of travel. It was all about communication. It basically set up the next 4 years of high school for me as being like primarily about communication. Um, and it's also where I ended up meeting like my first two high school boyfriends and where I had a group of friends, one of the only times I've had the whole group of friends. And so there was that. And then the second time was when I graduated from Whatcom and I got my associate's degree. So I was
Mm.
moving again from being at Whatcom to being at Western. So I was like moving to a different college. So it was another short distance like change in terms of like where I was traveling to go. And I also moved apartments, and it was another very short distance travel because the apartments that I was living in at the time, I actually lived in three separate apartments, kind of like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. That we lived in the first place was a three bedroom, and that was too big. So then we moved into the next one, and that was a one bedroom, and that was too small. So then finally we lived in that second bedroom, right, where we're like we eventually lived together again. But this was the move from the third, the three bedroom to the one bedroom, right? So it was travel like in two areas where I was like moving from one school to the next, from one apartment to the next, but in a short distance. And education, I was moving from one level of education to the next. And specifically, again, moving into something that was more communication focused, because then moving from my AA to my BA, I was moving from that breadth of education to specifically being in the junior year. Since I already had my AA, I didn't do all the prerequisite Western. I went
Mm.
straight into being an English major as soon as I got there. I was in my junior year. So it was like being right into communication again. And I feel like my third house years definitely have a lot of focus on that. And next year will be a third house. This next birthday that's coming up will be another third house year for me. So that should be interesting to see how that works, especially because I've been like fooling around with the idea of potentially applying and to go back for another master's degree or like doing things like that. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I don't really have any good third house connections. Cause yeah, age two, don't remember anything. And then age 14, yeah, the middle school thing. And that year we went to Hawaii, so that was like my second trip, but the first one I remember, which goes back to my MC in my third house. It plays on my heritage and ancestry, and so is going back to homelands that in a soul level feel familiar.
Mhm.
So I don't know, kind of that. And we met a lot of family that I had never met before that trip, so that was interesting. So if anyone is interested in exploring their houses like we're doing here, but in a more hands-on, tangible, creative, artsy fartsy type of way, we will be starting the Artful Houses series soon, and there's currently a wait list. If you're interested, you can just sign up on the wait list with the link below and let us know. Each month we'll be going through a different house in your chart. We'll personalize it, so we're looking at your specific birth chart, go through what it means to have a sign on that house and probably some of the planets in that house, and then we'll create art around it. It can be any type of art that you like: collage, paint, whatever you're into. We even thought about creative
Mhm.
writing, which would be an awesome third
Mhm.
house for sure if you have a jam packed third house. Um, and yeah, so check it out. The Artful Houses waitlist is below in the links. And we're good. Bye.
Bye.